right. Well, welcome back to another Time Out Tuesday. My name is Josh Party, Senior Pastor here at Hopevale, and we are concluding our question and response series to the Your Kingdom Come series that we just finished up this past Sunday. Once again, I have my wife here with me, Brandy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Yeah.
Loving the sunshine outside.
Yeah, it's been gorgeous weather recently.
It has.
Absolutely
Looks like it's
gorgeous.
going to continue.
Yeah, looking forward to it, and continue into next week, Thanksgiving week. So that brings up, what is your favorite maybe food item that you're most looking forward to this Thanksgiving? Doesn't have to be every Thanksgiving. And just in general, are there other things that you're looking forward to as we head into the holiday week?
Now I have to think, what's on the menu? I'm going to make a new corn souffle recipe, which I'm looking forward to. So
Yeah.
maybe that, or mashed potatoes are always great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the week, or what else I'm looking forward to? Is that what you asked?
Anything else you're looking forward to with the holiday week coming up?
My family's coming in, which will be great to be with them and have them here.
Yeah.
Nice weather.
Yeah.
So different schedule, change of pace for the week, which will be fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. What about
be a good week.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
What about you? Food.
I love Thanksgiving. It is like my favorite holiday in that it has just all of the things that I love, with none of the things that I don't love. So it's got food, family, and football, and it's very chill. It's just, we hang out and we play games and we relax and sleep and get to eat good food. So I think I just look forward to all of it. I look forward to all of the food except for my one exception, which you know, but I got to clue everyone else in. There is one thing at the Thanksgiving table that I believe could be an abomination to the Lord. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm being a little hyperbolic, but not a fan of stuffing. And stuffing is the potato salad of summer, right? Like stuffing is the
You and your
fall
potato
version
salad.
of that. Yes. And what happens with both of these dishes, you see, is that everyone thinks that theirs is the best. And so I tell them that I don't really like it generally. I mean, it's not like of all the things, it's not like it's like I can't stand it, but it's just like I don't want to leave room on my plate for that, right? And so people just continually, they're like, no, you have to try mine. You have to try mine. So I've tried like 60 versions of both potato salad and stuffing, and I just don't really care for either of them. And this is quite upsetting to some people, but I don't know what else to do. These are my taste buds. This is where I'm at, you know?
I do think it's a little absurd because I do love my potato salad. I'm one of
you
these
like potato
people.
salad and stuffing. Yeah, you know. So, well, whatever you are having for Thanksgiving, we'll trust that you're going to enjoy it, and it'll be a good time with family and friends and loved ones. So let's do maybe a quick run through of as we conclude the series. We've taken the past 6 weeks to talk about it. This prayer that Jesus invites us to pray. We started by saying, hey, we are intimately connected to the God of the universe, that he calls us sons and daughters. We saw that we, in week 2, are called the image God. We're to be like little idols of him, is kind of how we're created, his representatives, that there's a high calling. We saw in week 3 that it really is your kingdom come, your will be done. That the story of Christianity is not about us evacuating earth, but is about Jesus bringing heaven to earth. Then we were in the part of the prayer about give us our daily bread, forgive us our debts. And do we really want to trust that Jesus is our daily bread, or do we want to trust in other things and look to other things? Then we saw that we should pray, lead us not into temptation, talked about how temptation, that word there, can really be testing, and looked at some of Jesus' tests. And we're all going to walk through testing, and the reality is the call is, are we going to be faithful to following Jesus in that or not? And then we concluded this Sunday by looking at that little additional part of the Lord's Prayer that is kind of written in italics or block quotes or whatever it may be in our Bible, or little footnote at the bottom. Yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. And we talk about how Jesus' glory and power is very different than the way the world defines it, the way the world defines success. And so propose a question of, are you going to take Jesus on his terms? Are you willing to take and follow him on his own terms, not just your terms? My thesis was that, hey, Jesus reveals to us that God would rather be killed by his enemies than kill his enemies. And then the invitation was essentially the cross, right? Like, this is the call of Christianity. Will you pick up the cross and follow Jesus, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people disagree, all of that sort of stuff. And so that's the invitation that we get through the prayer. So
it's been great. It's been really good. I know somebody had mentioned they love that throughout too, you've really tied in the Old Testament and Moses, and how that's been a new piece. I feel like has given new insight maybe to a prayer that a lot of people I think we're familiar with. But we've gone deeper and got to learn some new things. And it starts jumping off the
page once you see it, right? Like once you see Jesus talk about, hey, God used to provide manna for you in the wilderness. I am the new manna, essentially. You know, like you see these passages and you're like, oh, wow, rich. That is really clear what he's doing here.
Yeah. I love really it. Cool. It's been really good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the recap. For this week, so we'll jump into the last little section that the sermon was on. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. And we kind of had multiple questions that were all pretty similar, that kind of had an overall question. And it's kind of, okay, so it's a nice sentiment, or great. This is really good to think about this way, or a perspective shift. But what about practically? Like, how do we think about then, like, violence, or what about self-protection, or wars, or situations?
How do we talk about military? How do we talk about all of these things, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And tying it back to, so if Jesus would rather die for his enemies than kill his enemies, and, tells Peter to put the sword away, and that's not the way of his kingdom. So how do we interact with that in the world that we do live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just love where the questions lead, because it's like, that's exactly what we should be walking away with, right? Is wrestling with this idea. And, there's only so much time in a sermon, which is the beauty of getting to do this podcast, where we can interact and really start to wrestle with those. And so what I want to say before we even hop in is this whole issue is a complicated issue that has been a part of the conversation in the church for 2,000 years, right? And it's a matter of discernment, of trying to figure out, what does it look like to do this faithfully? And I think anytime we're talking about an issue of discernment, we want to come to the table with a lot of grace, and we want to come and be very charitable, and hold space that we maybe are even wrong, and I think that I would want to draw our attention to that in any issue where there's possibly disagreement amongst Christians, right?
Absolutely.
And to be aware of the world we live in that doesn't allow space for that. A world that wants bombastic takes and responses, and loves the character that's like the cowboy or the maverick who has the mic drop moment,
Right.
And I just don't think that attitude or way of thinking is in line with the way of Jesus and his kingdom. And I don't think long term it helps. Like, it can feel good in the short term, but it's not the way of the kingdom. It's not the way of love. And so when we come to this topic, of thinking of like, wars and violence and how do we have protection? And, one of the questions was even like, okay, what do you do in extreme case with like Hitler, right? Like, there's real evil in our world. So how do we do this faithfully? And so I would, if you want to hear more about this, I might recommend a book, because we're not gonna be able to cover all of it, but there's a book called War, Peace, and Violence, and it's 4 Christian views. And so they're kind of like encapsulating and presenting the best arguments where the church has differed on this very topic of what this means and how to live this out faithfully. And I would say anytime you're thinking about an issue, there's a whole series that Zondervan, I believe, does on 4 different views of whatever said topic is. They have a bunch of different ones. And, if you're ever like thinking through an issue or wanting to wrestle deeper, I'd always point to that. That's a good place to start the conversation. The unfortunate part is like a lot of times we'll just read one. We are all guilty, I think, of this. We'll read one person and their view on it, and then we kind of just start parroting that view, right? And they're good views, even. That's not even a negative. Like, it could be well thought out and researched, but always want to just hold some space, right? That there could be some different takes or different ways of understanding it. So that's just kind of like foundational how I would want to approach that conversation. It's just super humble and saying, hey, this is a matter of discernment, and there's probably going to be disagreement, and that's okay, right? Like, the thing that we hold to is that Jesus has died and raised again. This is what unites us as brothers and sisters. And so we maybe will disagree on how to move forward on some of these issues, but that's okay. We trust that he's ultimately in control. Then I go from there and I'd say, okay, there's a couple different levels here, right? So there's kind of more of the corporate level, then there's more of the individual level. And so what does it look like let's start at the corporate level to, have some sort of defense so that citizens aren't vulnerable and at risk? And
so do you mean more of like a community societal level when you say corporate, not necessarily like the corporate like church, but like us as a community or a group of people?
Yeah, how does a
Okay.
nation think about this, right? Because we have real evil in this world. We know that as followers of Jesus, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the powers and the principalities, right? And they convince people to live into their ways and their systems and all those sorts of things that are against the kingdom of God. And so I think at both levels, the like national type corporate level and the individual level, there is this, for sure, I would think anyways, some sort of level of self-defense, right, that is available. And so maybe if we go down to the to the individual level for a second, right? Like if I'm with you or one of our kids or whatever, and someone is trying to bring harm to you, I don't think the loving thing for me to do is to just stand there and just say, well, there's nothing we can do here, right? Like I want to engage the person in a way that is appropriate to the level that they are responding, and I want to remove people from being harmed, right? And working to that. And I think that's a better, like, that's a good starting point of knowing how to enter in. Is I'm still not against even this person, right? Because my battle isn't against flesh and blood, but they're giving in to something here that is not of the way of God. And so that needs to be resisted. And that may mean using, like, getting in between or separating or, restraining someone until authorities can come, or, it could be a whole variety of things. So, now the problem is this conversation gets so theoretical that it's like, well, what about this? And what about that? And we can't sit here and answer all day every one of those, but I think that that's a good starting point. And I don't know that a lot of people start the conversation there, right? Like, we just kind of go to the most extreme scenarios that we can imagine or that have happened through history. And I don't think most of us are living in our day-to-day lives extreme scenarios, right? There may be some of us that are having to be a part of those conversations because we're maybe on, some sort of national defense panel or something, like where you really are wrestling with how do we do this? But most of us in our day-to-day life, we're dealing in the theoretical of extreme situations, right? And then usually what happens inevitably in this conversation is Hitler always gets mentioned, right? And what do we do in the case of, like, this just pure evil ideology and way of being? And so if we go into that, like I'd say, yeah, that needs to be stopped, and we need people to figure out how to do that, so that innocent people aren't being, harmed and sacrificed and all of the things every day. And so want to be thankful for the people who commit their lives to that and are willing to step into the gap and try to provide a world of peace and attempting for wars to cease, right? So if we go back to week 3 of talking about this series of Jesus is bringing heaven to earth, I mean, I think we can say like war is essentially hell on earth, right? Like there are extreme consequences that people face because of these decisions that people make to go to war, whatever their reasoning may be, if they're, in this case, like an extreme dictator or whatever it is, right? And they're literally creating a sense of hell here on earth that people are living out. But even when you get to the Hitler conversation, what's really fascinating about that whole thing, so lots of people are pretty well versed, for sure better than I am, in World War I and World War II history. But what's interesting is to know some of the history of the church there, and actually how this whole conversation begins and how Hitler rises to power and kind of secures power throughout. And the unfortunate part is that it happens through the German church kind of being co-opted into the ways of worldly power, and them becoming what was called like the German Christians, who embraced kind of more like nationalism and these terrible racial aspects of Nazi ideology, right? And so what happens is there's all of these pastors and theologians and religious leaders who endorse this because they're giving in to this way of not wanting to stand in the gap like Jesus does, right? And so it becomes actually there's this response movement by this group called the Confessing Church, where they kind of call that out and they rise up as the opposition to the ones who are called like the German Christians, and they have this confession of faith called the Barmen Confession of Faith that's kind of famous, and in that they're basically making the case of, hey, as the church, we cannot give our allegiance to any like nation or national ideology, in the sense that we kind of talked about on Sunday of like a Judas wanted, or the people wanted with Jesus Barabbas, right? It's that same type of ideology that's just manifested in a different way. And so the Confessing Church says, no, we only are allegiant to God and we follow him. And anything that's putting us compromising that, we need to stand into the gap for. And so there's people who are part of the Confessing Church then who lose their life as a result of that, because they're not willing to turn a blind eye to evil, right? And maybe a couple famous ones are Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and just fascinating guy. If anybody ever wants to read, it takes a little effort and work. And I would read not even biographies about him. I would just read his work and see what he has to say. But then there's a more popular story about a man named Franz. I mean, it's a German name, so I'll try my best. But it's Jagerstatter. I'm not sure. But Franz, there's a movie. Yeah, the movie. I think there's a book too called The Hidden Life. It's the story about him, and he gets pulled into essentially being called in to serve for the Nazi army, and he's just against it. He won't do it, and so it's his story of how he's kind of like this conscientious objector to living into this way of the sword, right, and picking up his cross. And I think it's a powerful story. Again, I'm not projecting that on any one of us, because it's a matter of discernment, right? But it's a powerful story, and maybe it gives us an imagination and a way of thinking about and understanding our world as we enter in and deal with real evil. And so there is some sense of, we can't allow harm to continue happening. Where and when that line is and how it looks is really tricky. And so we want to hold that loosely, and we want to do the best that we can to recognize that, again, our battle is against the powers and the principalities, not against flesh and blood. So, all right. So I said a lot. What strikes you as I say all that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I know we've had conversations about this, so I've gotten to take a little bit of a deeper dive with you. But it makes me go back to kind of the very first part when you're talking about corporate or individual. So if we go to individual and get like really practical, what might like this part of the prayer look like, or where might be like opportunities? So even like loving our enemies, like I feel that even that term, I don't think I have people in my mind that I even think of as my enemies. So what might that look like?
Yeah,
or
that's a great question. I think we do live in a world where maybe we wouldn't call them our enemies, right? But we live in a political system that always wants to paint the other side as the enemy, right? And that we need to be fearful, right? This happens within Christianity, when we talk about different theological views and understandings, right? And then it's like, well, this person is the enemy now because they hold a different view. So I think it's, well, I'm saying they're the enemy, but we wouldn't say that they're the enemy.
Right. We don't label that, but we resist or push them to the side, or have feel like we need to make clear lines or categories. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so then it's, if we're going to follow the way of Jesus, is how do we be a community of, and how we say it at Hopevale here, how do we be a community of grace and truth, right? Jesus is full of grace and truth. And so that means giving grace. And when you disagree with people, allowing space for that. And then you can still hold that what you believe to be true in your own life and allow grace for others. Right. So, and I think it's what we desperately all want when we're the ones who are wrestling, right? Like if you've ever, I imagine everyone has changed their mind on something in their life, right? And that probably didn't happen right away. Probably required a loving, safe place where you could be yourself and have the ability to wrestle through. That's all grace, right?
Yeah, right.
And then you come to see things in a new way, and you're like, oh yeah, that is. I think I've had that a little wrong, a little off. And so, yeah, I do agree. I don't know that a lot of people, I think some people do walk around with the ideas of enemies in our heads. It could be for sure, though, more subtle is what I hear you saying too, of like, we don't name them enemies, but the way we behave is we become vitriolic and divisive and angry, and we give up on following the way of Jesus. When there's disagreements about how to best proceed in the county meeting or the school classroom, or as opposed to how do I love this person well even during this disagreement.
Right. So it could be perhaps maybe a neighbor or a coworker or somebody who's just opposing us. Yeah. Or so it could be even, I think I'm just aware, even like little interactions with people, or it could be like, the team member that you're working with, and overall, whether it's making decisions or leading or could be in your business,
of a coworker or someone you report to, or they report to you, or I think of our own life, right? Like we formerly had a neighbor who lived right next door to us, who was really difficult. And, would try and report us to the city for all these things that we were allegedly doing. So the city would come, got to know all of them and the police officers pretty well. Cause
the firemen.
None of them were founded. Cause we always were following the rules. So I think of situations like that, and that's really hard, because you're just like, really, is this, so I need to spend my time dealing with this. But I think like that's that's the call, right? Like that's the beauty of the gospel, is that we get to live into still loving and caring for people, even if we aren't seeing results, even if people aren't changing to the ways. Like I would have loved this neighbor to not been that way, and for our life to be easier, and to not have that in the back of our mind every time we were hanging outside of, like, okay, what's going to happen this time? And is,
right.
This person going to come yell at us again, and all of that. Right. But that's not how life works. And I think the call to be faithful to Jesus is say, okay, how do I yet again faithfully interact and love this person well, even if they're choosing things that are, I think, wrong, So,
yeah.
And then that's the beautiful snowball effect, right? So we can experience that again, if we're getting super practical with our families, in our jobs, in our neighborhood. Like, this is what it means to live into the way of love. And love, my impulse, and maybe you all consider your impulse, is to try and reach for a lever that makes things happen so that we can just get progress. And the hard part with love is that it's messy, and you're dealing with brokenness and pain.
And it takes time and patience.
It takes time and it takes patience. And these are all the things that we are called into with the fruit of the Spirit, right? Like, to be people of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control and gentleness, right? Like, these are all good things, but we're not sure that we always want to trust in them because we don't know if they're effective. But I think that's always a good reminder, right? Like, we're called, we must remind ourselves, we live in a world that teaches us that we need to be successful in everything. And by that, it means the world's version of success. But I think when we figure out what following Jesus looks like, it's about us being faithful, right? And so for Jesus, being faithful meant being led to the cross. That would not be a success story that anyone would tell. The death on a cross was a criminal's death. It was to be this excruciating but also humiliating death that showed that you were of no importance. That we don't even have, if I recall, I don't think we have any names of anyone crucified before Jesus, even though we know they were doing it. It was to be that you were forgotten. And so you can look at the cross. That's how the world looks at the cross, right? And says,
it's foolishness.
It's foolishness, as Paul will say, right? It's foolishness to this world. But Jesus says it's actually the way to life. And so there's the invitation for us of, are you gonna be faithful in a time, in a place that so overvalues what being successful looks like. So,
well, I think that really pulls on like the piece of power, like, and do we trust in God's power? And that doesn't look like the world's power.
Right.
And it's even made me think of that in regards to, whether it is working with a neighbor or your boss or at your job. Often we think of power as being able to like have the authority to call the shots or to make the things happen, or, it's back to that like quickness. And oftentimes God's ways are, again, back to being slow and permeating it with faithfulness and that gentleness and these things that, we think maybe look like weakness, or the world would tell us that's weak. Like, why would you put up with that? Or why would you let that happen to you? Or, whatever the situation might be. And really it might be that like you're choosing to walk in a way of love and in the ways of Jesus, which mean entering in conversation and in kindness, means with sitting with the person or being, forgiving in a time, in a place where maybe somebody would say like, why in the world would you forgive? Why in the world would you?
We all long for forgiveness. We're not sure we want to offer forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the hard call. That's the beauty of it. So, Well, it has been a fun series. It's been fun having you here with me, getting to do this with you. And we have some new series coming out in the future.
I'm excited for them.
Time Out Tuesday is going to continue on. It's going to be great. Want to invite you to keep joining us here on Tuesdays, and just continuing to trust that Jesus has good things for us, that there's hope for all as we continue to say yes to him in all that we do. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for listening to our Hopevale podcast. To check out our full library, head to hopevale.org/podcast. If you'd like to support the ministry here at Hopevale, you can give by visiting hopevale.org/give. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to having you and your family join us at Hopevale Church.